kind of humbling, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all, because to me, I consider it an extraordinary privilege to have the chance to introduce to you World-Changing and Alex Steffen. I know most of you know something about Alex Steffen and World-Changing, but I'm not sure how many of you know how truly significant and salient his work has become. And I just want to give you a little bit of information about what's happening with him and what the things that he's done to just kind of place it in context. You know, World-Changing is a nonprofit ideas workshop, online magazine, and weblog committed to exceptional original journalism and creative work exploring sustainability and social innovation. So that's the concept there. And Alex is the person who put it together as the executive editor. He co-founded the organization in 2003. It's the next phase for him in a lifetime of work towards a sustainable future. In the 6 years since World-Changing has started, it's become one of the most widely read sustainability-related publications on the planet. And in 2006, they published their first book, World-Changing, A User's Guide for the 21st Century, which is an internationally best-selling overview of existing ideas for building a better future. Al Gore did the foreword. The design was by Steven Sagmaster, who won the National Design Award. It got great critical acclaim. It's they're now working on a second edition, and they're also preparing another book called Bright Green. Now, I just want to say a little bit about my personal experience with reading World-Changing. You know, I actually read a lot of things about sustainability, and I saw this 600-page book, and I thought to myself, okay, it's my duty. I got to dig into it and see what's there, and you know, maybe there'll be something interesting. Maybe there'll be something new and innovative. But when I actually did get into it and started reading it, it blew me away. It's truly extraordinary. The range of ideas, the range of creativity, the willingness to really reach out and tackle issues in very substantive ways and in ways that really look at how do you make these new connections that sustainability teaches us to make. I just found it really extraordinary. And so if you have not read it, I just want to tell you, go out and get it as soon as you can, because it really is going to be an extraordinary chance for you to pick up on the ferment that is taking place in the sustainability movement. So what that's meant as a result of this work is that World-Changing is now a steadily more influential and more influential voice in what's happening in the debate about sustainability and the future of our planet. So Alex has spoken at many, many different places, including many conferences, Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. It's a great threesome there. And he's consulted for businesses and governments from New Zealand to the Netherlands and cities from Copenhagen to Calgary. He has the great honor, I think, and this kind of is emblematic of the recognition of his work, that he will be giving the final address at the Copenhagen Climate Summit for mayors. And he'll also be giving the keynote at the Bright Green Business Expo. A great combination of somebody who governments will listen to and business will listen to. You know, I've known Alex for many years, since his involvement in Sustainable Seattle with me, and I'm going to give you a little known fact about him, which is not widely known, I guess, is the right way to put it. In 1997, when I was first running for city council, Alex and I sat down and worked together for about a month on putting together the platform and the ideas that we thought were important for local government. And I really profited from his knowledge and his experience and his insights during that time period. And of course, he's responsible for everything that I've done, especially the things that haven't worked. But it's really extraordinary to have seen the things that he was thinking about then, having moved to this whole extraordinary new level that he's taking them to now through World-Changing. And sometimes we don't recognize when we have somebody in our midst who is doing so much and has so much recognition from people outside of our city. But we are really privileged and blessed to have Alex as a member of the Seattle community. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Alex Steffen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Richard. That was a really lovely and overly generous introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is really a real pleasure to see so many old friends and colleagues in the audience, and perhaps some new friends and colleagues as well. And thank you as well to Town Hall for putting this together, and to our co-sponsors, the American Institute of Architects, the Bullitt Foundation, Climate Solutions, the Community Coalition for Environmental Justice, Green Drinks, Groundwire, Publicola, People's Parking Lot, 3 Degrees, Urban Land Army, Seattle Tilt, Sierra Club, Sightline, Sustainable Industries, Sustainable Seattle, and Undriving. Wow, that list is almost a talk in and of itself. Thank you as well to KUOW for being here, to the Seattle Channel for being here, and to the Bullitt Foundation for making it possible to record this event with a film crew. Thanks as well to the Fremont Brewing Company, which those of you who return tomorrow will have a chance to sample their wares at an after party, and to Skillet, which is outside cooking up some great sort of sustainably minded grub. And thank you finally also to all of our volunteers, Sean Conroe, Kamal Patel, Danica Reel, Jamie Richardson, Morgan Greenseth, and to, of course, Sarah Cook and Brittany Jacobs, my teammates at World Changing, without whom none of this kind of stuff would ever happen, because I'm way too disorganized to put something like this together. So with all that said, let's start the show. I thought that we would start today with the story so far, where we've come from, right? We are, in case you're really not up to speed, human beings on planet Earth, and that means that we are all related. We are all the sons and daughters of a common ancestor who scientists, in a really stunning burst of lack of imagination called mitochondrial Eve, a woman who lived about 140,000 years ago or so, and who was a common ancestor to all of us and to every other human being on the planet, right? The reason why we have a common ancestor so relatively recently is that humanity has gone through a series of population bottlenecks, which is, again, a very unpoetic term for describing really, really hard times. Humanity has almost died out, but we have struggled through, and we, in fact, are the descendants of the really crafty ones who figured out a way to survive, right? Tools, fire, agriculture, all of these things are means to make nature into stuff we can use, right? It's a simple observation, but it's one that's worth really thinking about for a second. Everything around us, right, is nature turned into stuff we can use. And it's tough surviving. Right? Nature is not always friendly, as this poor hunter-gatherer is finding out at the wrong end of a bison. Right? It has been a very tough road to get where we are. And we've not always been friendly back to nature. Right? This is a giant sloth. You've never met one of these. That's because we ate them all about 10,000 years ago. Right? They were big, slow-moving, and apparently really tasty. History is largely the story of us turning more and more of nature in more and more ways into things to eat and wear and trade. And really nothing in our world, other than what's inside our heads, right, is not from nature, right? Everything around us was either grown or mined, right? Everything around us comes out of the planet. Even nuclear energy, right? The crazy scientific atom thing is uranium that we've mined and done stuff to, right? We are, entirely a subset of nature, right? In the Industrial Revolution, starting roughly 200 years ago, we figured out that we could learn stuff about the planet and apply it in really systematic ways to converting nature into stuff, right? And away we went, because that suddenly made giant cities possible, right? And young people everywhere industrialization has happened have poured off the farms and into cities with the greatest of enthusiasm. Lots of really horrific things happened in the Industrial Revolution, but it's worth remembering that for pretty much everyone who's gone through it, it has meant a staggering increase in the amount of stuff and the amount of things that you can do. It's also meant access to medicine. And that has meant antibiotics, immunizations, public health, sewers, right? And a sort of sense of technological possibility, right? All this stuff could be summed up, I think, in the motto, more stuff, less dying. And that, as it turns out, has been a winner. People vote for more stuff, less dying. Our own wealth, right, has come directly from taking raw materials and fossil fuels from all over the world, usually by force, and then turning them into stuff. Our wealth is why we have a climate problem, right? It is the vacations that we took 10 years ago, the homes our parents built 30 years ago, you know, the roads our grandparents laid down 100 years ago that have put the carbon in the atmosphere, right? You can see in this little map, this is all of the CO2 emitted in the 20th century, right? You'll note that Europe and Russia and Japan, and above all, the United States, are pretty big. They're pretty big on that map, right? You'll note that many places where many people live, such as China, India, the Middle East, Africa, Central and South America, are very, very small, right? In fact, Canada has put about as many emissions into the atmosphere as all of Africa put together, right? The problems we are facing today, it needs to be said again and again and again, are our doing, right? We are rich because we created those problems. Most people on the planet are poor. Most people are young. Most people are ambitious, right? Most people live in conditions like these, right, of relative poverty, but aspire to conditions more like our own, right? The most shared common human technological experience is having watched Baywatch. You know, people all over the world know very well how we are living, and they have decided that they want to turn some of nature into wealth for themselves. Right? Completely understandable. But that means that we're on a collision course with ecological reality. We tend to think that we've somehow transcended the limits, right? That somehow limits are a thing of the past. It just isn't so. The planetary boundaries we face are incredibly real. We are being told in various ways by scientists that we are running up against them and in many cases transgressing them, and we are beginning to rack up consequences. Because we are utterly reliant on what's called ecosystem services, right? Things nature does for us to support our civilization, things like pollination and pest control and flood control. Because we're so reliant on these things, they have enormous value. The Deutsche Bank and the European Commission just did a study that found that we are losing natural capital at a rate worth between $2 and $5 trillion every year. You know, that's a couple bailouts every year that we're wasting of nature. We are putting our fellow creatures to a very sore test. About 1/3 of all the mammals on the planet face extinction, according to the IUCN. And we are seeing signs of collapse in basically every ecosystem on Earth. There's no place that's doing really great. Added to that is climate change. Now, everyone in this room understands what climate change is. We all know it's a problem, or you wouldn't be here. But we may not all realize that just in the last year, we have gotten some more recent news from scientists that has really snapped us to attention, or ought to. Right? For example, the Copenhagen Climate Science Congress came out with a key message that said, recent observations confirm that given high rates of observed emissions, the worst case IPCC scenario, trajectories, or even worse, are being realized. Right? There's significant risk that many of the trends will accelerate, leading to an increasing risk of abrupt or irreversible climactic shifts. Right? That's basically saying, hey, that worst case scenario we were talking about, that's where we're headed. Or as Lord Stern, The former chief economist of the World Bank, now at the London School of Economics, a real bomb-throwing radical, said, "This is not a small probability of rather unattractive outcome. This is a big probability of a very bad outcome." Right? Things that we thought might happen in the future are in fact beginning to happen now. As John Holdren, the president's climate advisor, said, "We are already finding climate change becoming more abrupt than we expected even a few years ago." And the most recent studies coming out of MIT's Center for Global Change Science found that we are looking at quite dramatic warming by the end of the century, perhaps as much as 7.4 degrees Celsius, right? And that we're going to see really big shifts even by 2030. Who here in this room is a woman 40 or under or a man 35 or under? Can you raise your hands? Okay. All of you, statistically, have a pretty good chance of being alive in 2050. Right? So this is not some science fiction world we're talking about, right? You're going to be, on your walker moving through this world, right? This is your future. And there are some even scarier things bouncing around out there. There are some potential tipping points, right? We're starting to understand that the permafrost that circles the Arctic is melting and releasing methane. And even more scarily, there's some signs that the methane that's been frozen on the floor of the ocean in the Arctic is starting to release. And we're starting to see some signs that the ocean is acidifying a lot more rapidly than we thought. The oceans take up CO2 as we emit it, right? We burn coal and oil, it goes up in the atmosphere, it falls into the ocean takes it up. It changes the chemistry of the water. And all sorts of creatures have evolved for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, to that chemistry, right? So when you change the chemistry, you suddenly start doing things like making it really hard for small creatures to build their shells, right? And those small creatures are the very fundament of all life on Earth, right? Pretty much everything on Earth depends on tiny little critters in the ocean. And if we push too much acidity into the ocean, right, that will collapse. And there's signs that we're headed that way. That's a pretty big deal. But even if we don't go that far, right, we are pretty much committed now to 2 degrees Celsius warming, right? Because we've already put a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. There's a lot that we know we're going to emit because we can't change more than a certain amount, no matter how hard we try, and we're not even trying that hard. So we pretty much know that we've bought this ticket. We're definitely going to take the ride for 2 degrees. 2 degrees is scary. It's pretty crazy. But in places like Seattle, it's going to be something we can live through. It's going to mean that things get weirder and weirder, but it doesn't have to mean, the ecopocalypse. 6 degrees, on the other hand, and you get into the real road warrior stuff, This is, guys in leather outfits prancing around the Arctic. It could mean an ice-free planet, right? No permanent ice anywhere. It could mean 1/3 of the land turned into deserts. It could mean basically all the tropical forests burn. It could mean alligators in the Arctic, right? That's the kind of change we're talking about. We haven't seen this kind of change as a species since our great, a million times removed grandmother was a tree shrew, basically, right? Tiny little primate up in a tree. That was the last time we saw something like this. This is completely beyond our experience, right? So we don't want to be here, because in a world of 6 degrees warming, there's no good place to be, right? And all of these problems worsen, and in turn are made worse by the fact that a lot of people are living just hanging on our planet, right? We talk about the bottom billion. There are about 1 billion people who don't have enough for their just fundamental needs of life, and that makes them incredibly vulnerable. And as it turns out, desperate people and nature don't mix well, right? Because desperate people do whatever they can to turn nature into stuff to eat and wear and live in, right? And a world of rapidly destabilizing climate combined with lots of desperate people is a really bad place to be. So can we just bunker down and wait it out? Can we just build some fallout shelters, 1950 style, and please give us a wake-up call when the climate's restabilized. Well, no, it turns out that we can't actually do that. In part because one of the things that's really difficult for some people to grasp about this is that warming doesn't just mean warming, right? It means instability. Things get crazy. It might look like a good time to be living over here, but actually the next year, that's a really bad place to be, right? There's no sort of safe way out of a world that's headed down that path. Well, okay, what about a magic bullet then? Right? We've heard a lot about geoengineering. What if we, spew up an artificial volcano into the atmosphere, or seed the ocean with iron filings, or cover the pole in white plastic? All of these are things that people are talking about doing. Would we be okay then? Well, the answer is no. The Royal Society, which is the UK's scientific body, put it really pretty straightforward here. The safest and most predictable method of moderating climate change is to take early and effective action to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. No engineering method can provide an easy or readily acceptable alternative solution. Right? It just won't work. The only reason, basically, that we're talking about this, right, is on the one hand, there are a lot of people who get the science and are scared about what could happen. And they are wondering if there might be some last-ditch thing we could do if things get really bad. And you can tell those people are legit because they'll start by saying, first we ought to stop emitting greenhouse gases. Then we might want to look at geoengineering. Whenever you hear somebody say that geoengineering is a solution, you know you're being spun. And in fact, all the same people who were telling us that climate change wasn't a problem over the last 20 years, right? All the various American enterprise institutes and these sorts of think tanks and petroleum and oil-based funded sources. All of those folks are basically trying to convince us that we don't need to act, that there's another way out, and it's just not true. Okay, so what about like building a rocket ship and getting away, right? Can we just leave? Well, it turns out not so much either, because space is vast, right? Space is almost unimaginably vast. And colonizing it is really far beyond anything we're capable of doing now. I think Bruce Sterling really sums it up pretty well when he says, "I'll believe in people settling Mars at about the same time I see people settling the Gobi Desert. The Gobi Desert is about 1,000 times as hospitable as Mars and 500 times cheaper and easier to reach." Right? So there's no leaving the planet till we clean up our mess. So what does that leave us with? I mean, is it just game over? Are we just headed over the cliff? Are we going to be involved in a process of cascading collapse? Are we headed into another population bottleneck? Right? Are the James Lovelocks of the world who predict that we're going to be reduced to mating pairs in a warming Arctic? Are they right? I don't know. I mean, this is what's at stake with what we're talking about. We're talking about the future of humanity and of civilization. We're talking about making decisions in the next 40 years that are going to have effect for generations, right? Hundreds of generations, in some cases thousands of generations. In some cases, they are permanent. We do them and the planet will never ever be the same again, right? As we go through the next few decades, we might almost think of the next 1,000 generations looking back at us, right? Because they're going to judge what we do. That's some pretty heavy stuff, So let's take a little break. Puppies. Everyone likes puppies, right? Or maybe your thing is more kittens. Well, we don't need to choose, really. In all seriousness, figuring out how to deal with information this big, this heavy, this oppressive, right, is a really important task that we have not thought enough about. You gotta take care of yourself if you're one of the people who's dealing with this stuff, right? There's a friend of mine is working on a story right now talking about climate scientists, and there's a wave of depression sweeping through the climate science field. This stuff is heavy. You gotta take care of yourself. You gotta try and go a little light on one another. And you also have to remember that doom is not the only possibility, right? Transcendence is still possible, right? We could go driving off the cliff. We could decide to soar. And it's possible that we could forge a civilization now, right, whose demands are easily met by nature, right, until we have the possibility of using so little that we could live here for a very long time on the planet. We have about 1,000 years in our sun, or excuse me, about 1 billion years left in our sun. 1,000 years would be a whole different thing, wouldn't it? There's some great movies that start that way. But anyway, we have about 1 billion years left until the sun starts expanding and boiling away the oceans and stuff. 1 billion years is a really long time, right? 1 billion years is about 100,000 times our total history, right? We have about 10,000 years of civilization behind us, right? So that's potentially 100,000 civilizations to iterate new ideas, right? If we can get it right, if we can live in balance with the planet, we have all this incredible horizon ahead of us, right? And who knows, in that time, maybe we can figure out a solution to a sun that is expanding. Maybe we can, over enough time, colonize the universe, right? Maybe there is, in fact, no end to the story ahead of us. That would be lovely. But first, we need to learn how to live on one single planet in ways that don't chew up the fabric of that planet so that it can be used for a very long time. That's not something we've thought about doing for very long. It's important to remember the idea that we're going to live on this planet for the foreseeable future with the natural systems we have now, right, is really just a few decades old. Right? It wasn't all that long ago that everyone thought the world was flat and made 6,000 years ago. And it certainly wasn't that long ago when everyone thought the world was endless and there was no way to use up resources. And Copenhagen, right, the meetings that are happening in Copenhagen next month are really the first time humanity is getting together to talk about how to make a civilization that doesn't use up nature. Right? That's a pretty hopeful thing, right? And it may get even more hopeful if we see, for example, our president attend. There are reasons to think we can build that kind of a civilization. One of them is this idea of decoupling, and this is pretty cool because, for a long time we've thought more is more, right? More is better, right? If it was good to have one car, two are better. If it was good to have a car that weighed 1,000 pounds, 2,000 pounds is probably much, much better, right? And, we're finding now that, in fact, it is possible to deliver the stuff of life that we want, right, the kind of prosperity we want, without using things up, right? It is possible to decouple wealth and impact, right? We're seeing this in all sorts of ways. It's hard sometimes to think about, right? We're so used to thinking that more stuff, using more stuff equals having more wealth, that sometimes it's hard to even imagine an alternative. But think about it this way. Think about the Mona Lisa, right? The Mona Lisa has incredible value. Right? We don't price the Mona Lisa based on the number of tubes of oil paint it would take to paint it again. Right? We price it based on what it adds to our civilization. And we're finding that more and more kinds of things can, in fact, be separated from natural impact. And it's ultimately possible that we may even be able to design our societies to have less than zero net impact, right? That we could go from having an ecological footprint of how much damage we do to the planet to having an ecological handprint of how much healing we bring to the planet, right? It's possible that we could leave behind a better and more complex and more resilient biosphere with each passing generation. That's a goal worth shooting for, and that's something that should make us feel hopeful. There are a whole host of impacts that we need to eliminate. Ozone depleting chemicals, endocrine disruptors, they're a nasty little bit of work. Habitat and biodiversity loss, nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, it goes on and on, right? You could make a career out of just noting the ways that we're doing dumb things. But really none is more important than climate change. And to understand what we need to do for climate change, you really just need to think about 5 numbers. And the first one is 350. Scientists tell us that if we can reduce the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases to 350 parts per million, which is how we measure these things, that we have a pretty good chance of stabilizing. You know, we'd like to do better, but that's a pretty good place to be. If we can hit that, we've got a good shot. We're at 387 right now. So we're already past the mark, and we're headed up and up and up. If we go beyond 450 parts per million, right, we start to trigger, we believe, more and more feedback loops that make it harder and harder not to generate more greenhouse gases, right? Start melting the permafrost even faster, burning off the rainforests, right? You really want to make sure that you level off at about that 450 and then start coming back down. Right? And to level off at about 450 means that we have to have an average impact on the planet of about 1 metric ton of CO2 per capita by 2050. Right? That's pretty clear marching orders. Unfortunately, this is where we're at now. You can see the United States is about 20 metric tons per capita, so we are talking about a 95% reduction in our climate footprint to get there, right? I'm confident that that 95% reduction is going to happen. You know, it's just how, right? It can either happen because we chose for it to happen, because we decided to shift what we're doing, or it can happen because we basically crashed the system, right? We don't want the latter, we want the former. And we want to do it very quickly because we have to change this fundamental fact about the world, which is right now there are only 2 kinds of people, right? There are the poor and frugal and the rich and wasteful, right? People basically jump directly from being very poor and having almost nothing to being planet destroyers themselves, right? You'll notice that there's a little box down in the corner that people call the Sustainable Development Quadrant, which is being rich and frugal. You'll also notice that there's nobody in it. That's where we need to be headed, right? We need to be going in that direction. We need to invent a model of prosperity that's climate neutral, non-toxic, closed loop, and ecologically restorative, right? We need to start to take the ecological debt we've been running up of the systems we've been destroying and bring it back down so that we actually start to restore systems to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, et cetera. Right? That's what we need to be doing now. And that model needs to be up and running immediately. And this is where things get really tricky, right? Because if we want to have any hope of the entire rest of the world that's scrambling to get out of poverty, adopting the kind of model we're suggesting, we have to do a lot of the spade work ourselves. That means we have to get on it and get it going. That means that we have about 20 years, really, people believe the curves suggest, to get that model developed, to actually show that it's possible. We have about 20 years to change a fundamental aspect of our civilization, which is that it chews up nature, right, into something else. That's not a small task, right? But there are, again, reasons to believe that it can be done. And in fact, the very idea that it can't be done, the very idea that this is impossible, that there's no way to do this, is itself, we know, political spin. Right? We know that people who are benefiting from the chewing up of nature are very, very, very good at paying people to tell us we can't do this. Right? Because the end of the model of chewing up nature means the end of their profits. One of the reasons we believe that this can happen, right, is all about the kids. We live on a really young planet. The median age on the planet is about 28 years old. But the median age in the least developed countries is only 19. Right? And that means that half of the population of the least developed countries are teenagers or children. Right? Very, very young. And that is an opportunity in some ways, because we know that as this says, when girls stay in school and get an education, poverty has no chance. Or, as we might say, when you educate girls, when you ensure women's access to property rights and legal protection, when you connect them with job opportunities and health care, when you give them reasons to believe that their kids will have happy, healthy lives, women pretty much everywhere and in all situations, by and large, choose to have fewer kids. Right? That's not the situation we have now, quite clearly, right? Women's rights are far from well distributed even here, right? And many, many women have access to almost nothing that they need, including about 200 million women right now who are in childbearing years and don't have access to contraception, right? But if we change that, if we actually change the status of women on this planet, we could see peak population come relatively quickly. Right? We could see the point at which women have few enough children that we basically level off in the replacement rate. It's already happened in places like Japan and Italy, right? That we see the population basically hit a constant, maybe even go down over time. We think that that number can be about 9 billion people by about the year 2050, right? And that after that, we will not have to deal anymore with the prospect of population growth. That's why women's rights are the most powerful sustainability technology we have. You know? That's why fundamentally, right, we have to start thinking about sustainability as being first and foremost, right, about making sure that the kids who are alive today have wonderful childhoods. That sounds very airy-fairy, right? But it's not. It is fundamentally the way that we can ensure that people are able to develop along paths that are better for themselves and the planet. Right? We're not doing this today, but we could, right? We could help kids like this have a different future. And part of what will help us do that is that we're rapidly becoming a very, very urban planet. There are more people who live in cities than who don't. Right? And between now and 2050, we're going to see an increase of over 3 billion people who live in cities. Right? That is 200,000 people a day, every day, for the next 40 years. Right? So that's roughly a city of Seattle every 3.5 days. Right? We're going to be building an urban area with the population of about Seattle every 3.5 days for the rest of most of our lives. Right? That's really a huge task, but it's also, in some ways, right, a really great thing, because what it means is that pretty much everybody will be connected into the urban fabric. Already, there's almost nowhere on the planet where you aren't within ready access of a city. This is a map of how far it takes to travel to a major city. You'll notice that if you're not in the Sahara, the Amazon, the Arctic, or the Tibetan Plateau, it's pretty easy to get to town, right? And urbanization is a very, very good thing for the planet, right? It's a good thing for a number of reasons. Higher incomes, right? With higher incomes actually come lower impacts when done properly. More freedoms, more innovation and transformation, right? We gain more momentum by having people in the cities, right? The 40 largest megacities in the world, which are home to only 18% of the world's population, produce 2/3 of the global economic output and nearly 9 in 10 of every new patented invention, right? So fundamentally, engines of progress live in cities. 9 billion peasants, we'd be in for one heck of a rough ride. 9 billion citizens, and we have a chance. It's difficult, though, sometimes to understand and to remember what the poverty that people around the world are facing means, right? All of us live absolutely saturated with information and access to knowledge. So we tend to forget that poverty is, above all else, not having access to knowledge, right? It's not knowing things. It's not being able to read. It's not knowing what good hygiene is. It's not knowing how to build a better well, right? And billions of people still live in states where they don't know things, right? It's not to say that they are stupid, right? They are deprived. And we are finding, in fact, that it is very easy to change that, right? And that it is mostly a matter of politics. We're finding that there are all sorts of inventions that we can readily create to change their daily lives, right? So these are the various rolling drums that people have invented, right? Most of the time, people have been carrying water from the well to the home, usually women. And, you know, it's a pretty arduous task. Imagine if you had to carry all your water home from a well every day, right? That would really suck. But, you know, here you put the water in this donut, essentially, and you roll it along the ground, and, you know, you take it home with a fraction of the effort. And there's lots of opportunities for us to design helpful tools. This is Plumpy Nut, right? It's a food designed for malnutrited children, right? One of the real tragedies of profound hunger is that it can actually sap the will to eat. So even once food becomes available, people continue to starve, especially children, right? This is a food, they went around the world and they said, okay, what foods do people like? And well, it turns out that kids pretty much everywhere like peanut butter. And so it's essentially a vitamin-soaked peanut butter, right? And it gives kids nutrients, it helps them survive, it tastes good, right? There's lots of things like this that we could do. For example, the life straw. It's a pretty amazing invention. You put one end in almost any water, no matter how polluted, and you put the other end in your mouth and you suck, and clean water is what you drink. Pretty phenomenal. You know, filters almost any water. This is one of my favorite things ever. This is a landmine detecting flower. It is a prototype that was developed to solve the problem of landmines. Right? There are hundreds of millions of unexploded landmines scattered throughout the developing world. And nobody knows where they are. Right? And going out and finding them is a very slow process unless you find them by accident, in which case it's a very fast process. The idea here, right, is that because explosives emit certain chemicals as they start to decay, you could breed a flower that would change color in the presence of those chemicals. So you sow flowers across a field. Where they come up white, you know it's safe. Where they turn red, you know there's a landmine. You know, I love that idea. I love the idea that we can conquer vicious stupidity with flowers. And why shouldn't solutions be joyful, too? This is, you know, all of us have seen the old water pumps that you have to pump like this, and it's a real drag. Well, this harnesses the closest thing we have to free energy, which is the energy of children, and as they play on the merry-go-round, it pumps the water up, right? Really pretty brilliant. And innovation and diffusion of innovations are what it's all about, right? We don't have a model for sustainability, not here, not anywhere on the planet, not any time in the past. If we're going to get to sustainability, it means changing a lot of things very quickly. In order to do that, we have to get really good at sharing and acknowledging when people have come up with good ideas, right? There's plenty of ingenuity waiting to be unleashed in the developing world, right? This is the pot-and-pot refrigerator. Brilliant idea. 2 clay buckets, essentially clay jars, with a layer of sand in between, water poured in there, cloth put on the top. The evaporation of the water keeps the inner pot cold. It's essentially a powerless refrigerator, right? Or power-free refrigerator. And leapfrogging offers the possibility of doing even more. The idea behind leapfrogging is pretty simple. There are many people in the world who have not gone through the same steps that we've gone through to get the technologies we have. Take phones, for instance. You know, we started by stringing telegraph wires, right? Then we made them into telephone wires. We distributed landlines. You know, we built payphones. We then proceeded to get cell phones, and now we're in this weird mix of, you know, broken payphones and iPods, right, or iPhones. Well, in lots of parts of the world, there are no landlines. There never were any telegraph wires, right? There's no wires at all. And in places like that, why would you go back and build a telegraph, right? You wouldn't. You just start with the cell phone. You just build a cell phone tower and you've got phone service, right? You can leapfrog over that state that we had to go through of landlines, right? The great thing about this is that it applies to a lot of things. It's possible actually to take a lot of different kinds of technologies and introduce them into new circumstances and have them work better there than they do here. For example, a study was just done by the World Bank that found that because the country of Mexico has so few established systems in certain critical regards, they could actually leapfrog towards climate reductions, that they could eliminate, right, any future emissions growth for $3 billion a year. That's not a lot of money. $3 billion a year for an entire country to go, steady state on its emissions is pretty cheap, right? And it's only possible because they don't have mistakes to undo at the same order of magnitude that we do, right? Given enough seed technologies and solutions, the global south can transform itself, right? We don't need to ride in there and tell anyone what to do. We need to get our own house in order, and they'll take care of themselves. And there's lots of great work being done on making sure that the two connect, right? Lots of innovative work being done about how you diffuse innovation, right? There are access to knowledge campaigns that deal with intellectual property rights. There's open architecture network and other things like it that help people share designs across boundaries. There are South-South science programs that help people scientists focus on problems that mean something to people who don't have money to pay them, right? Also things like free textbooks, copyleft ideas, right? The idea that we can create ways of assigning intellectual property that make it easier to share, right? And everything ought to be built that way here. Everything that can be. This talk is built that way. This talk is not copyrighted. This talk is under a Creative Commons license, which means that you can share it, you can copy it, you can distribute it, you can do all sorts of things with it. All you have to do is tell people where it came from and not charge people for what you're giving them. In this particular case, we have a no derivative works thing, which means that you can't bust it up and break it into a music video, I'm afraid. But that's mostly just because I'm saying some things here that demand their context to make sense. By and large, I believe that you ought to basically let people do whatever they want with whatever they want. And the kind of world we're describing here, right? A world where there are billions of people moving into cities, young people starting their families, making better choices about what they want in life and having the ability to live those choices, right? And being connected to one another and sharing innovation. It's a really different world than we're used to thinking about, right? When we think India, we're used to thinking, a peasant in a field with a water buffalo. Right? We're not used to thinking a billion people on their way to living a version of life very much like our own, but hopefully better ecologically. Right? We need to change our thinking. We've got this problem, right? We've got what I like to call a paradigm rift, right? We failed to jump from our old paradigm to what's actually happening around us. We failed to keep up with reality. We are not the first group of people to confront this problem, right? About 20 years ago today, East Germans were pouring into West Berlin, right? Really excited, unexpected thing. Wow, the walls come down, communism is dead, let's go check this all out, right? It turns out that the people behind the Iron Curtain were in for a bit of a shock. This was the utmost in automotive technology in East Germany. It's the Trabant. A two-stroke engine car, which is known mainly now for being a collector's item. And people suddenly encountered the reality that everything they thought worked didn't work the way they thought it worked, right? Communism didn't work. Central planning didn't work, right? The corruption endemic in anti-democratic states didn't work, and suddenly they were forced to deal with things differently, and they responded in different ways. The Czechs had a tradition of dissidence and had been talking about what to do when they got the damn Russians out for a long time, right? I know, I was there actually, shortly after the wall came down. I spent some time in what was then Czechoslovakia, and I saw young people there, right? And they were really on it. They wanted to know about this democracy stuff. How does it work? Each person gets a vote? That's crazy, But, they were getting it. They wanted to know what capitalism like, what was entrepreneurship like, how do you build a civic realm, how do you make a university work, et cetera, right? They were asking these questions and really grappling with these things, and they really took it on whole hog, right? They embraced the new paradigm and tried to do their best to become a country that could live up to it. As a result, Prague is one of the world's great cities. The Czech Republic is part of NATO and the EU and ranks 36th per capita in GDP, or 36th in per capita GDP, and it's the first formerly communist country to be classified as developed by the World Bank. Life is pretty good there, right? They embraced change and things got better. Albania went a different direction. This was, after all, the country of Enver Hoxha, who created Hoxhaism, which has been described as the school of thought for those who thought Maoism was too lenient. He had basically eliminated almost all private property, cut off almost all outside influences, eliminated essentially all political opposition, and went on a binge of paranoia that left the country scattered with 750,000 bunkers. You're hearing me right, 750,000 bunkers. There are 3 million Albanians. Right? So what did they do, these 3 million Albanians and their 750,000 bunkers when the wall fell? Well, they basically didn't change anything. Right? The ruling party changed its name from the Socialist Workers' Party to the Workers' Rights Party or something, and went right back into office and ran things exactly the way they'd been running them, continued similar policies, and basically doubled down on the bunker mentality, hissing at the West. Right? As a result, their entire economy was basically black market economy, right? And especially pyramid schemes. Remember Bernie Madoff? Well, imagine the entire economy being run by Bernie Madoff. 2/3 of all Albanians were invested in pyramid schemes. By 1997, they were half of the total Albanian economy, right? We're like chain letters and stuff, right? Now, when they fall apart, as they always do, there were riots. Those riots killed 2,000 people. Right, and they toppled the government. And Albanians woke up and realized, wow, we are not in a good place. Here's a measurement of what a good place they weren't in. If you Google Czech innovation, you get 6,570,000 Google hits. If you Google Albanian innovation, you get 114. And the top hit isn't about Albanians themselves, it's about their language, right? When you double down on broken systems, you stifle innovation, right? And you promote crazy investments. So now Albania is really in a mess of trouble, right? It's got a serious mafia problem. It's 111th in per capita GDP, right? Which ranks it behind such economic powerhouses as Angola, Cuba, and Kazakhstan. Right? When Kazakhstan's significantly outperforming you, just saying. Now, this is not about Albanians being stupid. They're not. It's not about them not being creative. They are. Right? We're not picking on Albanians here. Right? We are pointing out that you can make choices that cut off all sorts of possibilities and leave you with all sorts of troubles. Right? Young Albanians are doing some really cool things. They're trying to find, for example, new uses for their bunkers. One of the ideas being turning them into hotel cottages. Right? That's pretty cool. That's a pretty gutsy thing to do if you're left with 750,000 bunkers. But I'd put it to you that being in the position of trying to turn pillboxes into real estate is not where you want to be. Right? The moral of this story is don't be Albania. Albania had to confront the failure of the idea of communism. Right? They didn't do it. We have to confront a different idea, which is the failure of the idea of limitless nature. Right? We have built a way of life that is all about cranking nature through machines, delivering them to stores, taking them home and throwing them away. Right? Pieces of nature all over the place. If we want to be more like the Czechs and less like the Albanians, we need to realize that that way of life is over. Right? It is as outdated and passé as, saluting Comrade Lenin. Right? We are in a different moment. And we should see that because we're seeing the kinds of collapses that the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc saw. Take the outermost ring of suburbs, right? We are seeing millions of homes in foreclosure. We're seeing half-built projects. We're seeing whole towns collapsing, right? Now, while it may be true that the ruins of the unsustainable are the 21st century's frontier, it doesn't make them any less ruinous, right? Having to rebuild the outer ring of the suburbs is basically like having to rebuild bunkers, right? They're useless pieces of property that we need to try and figure something out to do with. And basically, the building of those things is what crashed our economy. There's more and more evidence that the foreclosure crisis was basically caused by the latest wave of sprawl, right? And in part, it's because those houses were they weren't bad houses that then ended up getting silly loans. They were bad loans that ended up getting silly houses, right? The houses were just a vehicle to cut the loans, right? A lot of people never thought they were actually going to be worth anything, right? It was one big scam, essentially. And we now find ourselves in a position where credit is really tight, where people are hurting. We have double-digit unemployment, right? And a very tight economy is expected to be the norm for some time to come, and we may never see the kind of credit that we saw in the 2000s. Right? And the costs associated with building suburban development may mean that it's done. Right? We may be done with suburbs. And we may be done with suburbs not because folks like us in this room had our way, but because people who invest in real estate won't go there anymore. The Urban Land Institute and PricewaterhouseCoopers, again, real bomb-throwing radicals, said road congestion, higher energy costs, and climate change concerns combine to alter people's thinking about where they decide to live and work. It's a fundamental shift. Right? We are moving away from the model of prosperity that we thought really defined the American way of life. Right? And we're facing sudden shortages. Right? We used to laugh about people in the Eastern Bloc going to the store and having only left boots to pick from, right? But we are actually in a situation, we are dependent on all sorts of virgin metals and other materials that are running out, right? There's a finite amount of them that we can access for a reasonable amount of cost, and we're basically using it up. We're facing peak everything, On top of that, we are about to, I believe, go through what you might think of as a chemical perestroika. For the last 30 or 40 years, but especially the last 8 years, we've been really falling behind the rest of the world in understanding what some of the chemicals that we surround ourselves with do to us and to nature. We live in a toxic bath, sort of in our daily lives. And I'm pretty sure that as that information starts to become more widely heard and less easily suppressed, that we're going to find more and more people not wanting to buy products that are made with toxic stuff, not wanting to live in homes that contain toxic things. I think that we're going to start to see a real push away from this whole model of sort of cheap things made with whatever chemical happens to make them best. And if you want my pick for a wild card trend for a good long-term investment, it's green chemistry. It's people who are making chemicals that can be used for some of these same things that have no toxic or environmentally disruptive attributes. Trade is also working differently, right? For a long time, we basically have borrowed money, sent it to China, and they've sent us back cheap crap, right? That's been a big part of our economy. Well, it's not really working that way anymore. This is the so-called recession armada off the coast of Hong Kong. These are all ships that don't have enough cargo to leave, right? Things are breaking down in the ways that we thought they once worked. Now, trade isn't going away. We're still going to trade things. But the idea that we can move lots of cheap, bulky stuff around, because basically trade is too cheap to measure, that's over too, right? We're going to need to be a little more selective about what we ship where. A good example of this is food. Now, there's a problem with our understanding of local food, which is that most of us tend to think that the best thing about local food is that it didn't come from far away. Right? All that oil we saved. Well, that's not actually it. Right? It turns out that when you look at the average impact of the average meal on the average American plate, the food came from about 1,000 miles away. And that transportation, though, only accounts for 4% of the carbon impact of that average meal, right? It's about a 20th, you know, of the impact of the meal itself, right? Doesn't mean that local food doesn't matter, but what it means is that production is a problem. How we make our food is critical. Meat is a problem. If you want to do one thing to be personally responsible in face of climate change, stop eating beef, or at least eat a lot less of it. Farmland preservation is a huge problem, but shipping is not the biggest problem. The real importance in supporting local food and local forestry, right, is being able to have a direct input on how things happen around us. Because we are going to be more and more reliant on needing to be able to fall back on what's close by. Food security is one of those kinds of issues that made you a little bit of like kind of a militia gun nut person about 10 years ago, but it's a real problem. In fact, it is such a problem that the UN has reported recently that nearly 20 million hectares, about 50 million acres of developing world farmland, right, about half the size of all the arable land in Europe, has been bought up in the last few years by outside interests. Right? Big money is taking the idea of food security very seriously, and they're diversifying their farmland to Africa and South America and around the rest of the world. The idea of regional food security is not something that we need to laugh away, especially when the benefits of doing what it takes to protect food security, right, supporting local farmers, supporting local foresters, are things we want to do anyway. Right? That's the reason to buy local. Right? That's the reason to invest in local infrastructure around this stuff, is to help the people who are doing the right thing close to where we live. Same thing's true of the ecosystem services around us, right? Our supply of water is dependent on the climate, but it's also dependent on the mountain ecosystems that we have. If we fall prey to the same kinds of problems that we're starting to see in the Rockies, right, with insect infestations and forest die-offs, we're gonna be in for a rough ride here. We're going to have to take very seriously the idea that the mountains, you know, from which we get our water are our backyard, that they're part of our city, they're part of how we relate to the world. In a similar way, we're going to have to take seriously that the water we look at every day is part of our world. This is something really cool, right? We've officially redefined where we live. We still live on Puget Sound, but Puget Sound is now part of the Salish Sea, right, which includes Strait of Juan de Fuca and the Georgia Straits. And it basically, that's our home area, and we need to be paying attention to it. The problems that we have created in Puget Sound and farther out into the Salish Sea are huge. There's huge potential benefits. We could go on and have a whole nother talk about that. We'll have to save that one, though. And climate change is, of course, changing our relationship with the sea itself. Right? The seas are rising. They are rising faster than we thought they were. We're probably not going to be in this position anytime soon. We're not going to be holding underwater cabinet meetings like the nation of the Maldives. But, you know, things are serious. We can expect wilder storms, hotter, drier summers, wetter winters, snowpack getting less as sort of the snow melts and less snow falls, and more snow falls as rain. You know, forest fires that are more severe, dead zones in the Sound, all sorts of weirdness, right? All sorts of things getting crazier in a pretty short period of time. In fact, Homeland Security has started preparing these sort of guides for local governments to use to figure out what to do about disasters. And I was particularly like sort of stunned by this one. It's part of a much longer guide. There are little icons that you can use to create maps about what's happening around you. And you'll see they've got some of the things you might expect. Wow, there's a tornado, a tropical cyclone, tsunami. And then they have some weirder ones, like reptile infestation, which is defined as a harassing or troublesome invasion of reptiles. Which begs the question, what is an invasion of reptiles that's not harassing or troublesome? Have you ever heard anybody say, wow, we had a really great invasion of reptiles this year, didn't we? You know, I mean, things are going to get weird, right? And although our region is going to experience some severe impacts, other regions are going to be much harder hit, right? Think back to the 30s. Think back to the Dust Bowl, right? 2.5 million people picked up and moved from the Great Plains in just about 5 years. Another 1.6 million African Americans moved from the south to the north. And part of that was absolutely the fact that racism was even more endemic in this country then, but a lot of it also had to do with drought and insect infestations and weird stuff that happened because of the weather, right? If that migration happened today, that total migration would be 15 million people picking up and moving. And we have parts of the country that are hanging by a thread. You know, the Southwest is facing what people are now calling a permanent drought. It has already hit its peak ability to pump fossil water out of the ground, right? That water's been there for thousands of years. It's not coming back. It's like burning oil. Dams are not remaining full, right? And they've built sprawl in places that it's just really hard to maintain. If things get too weird, a lot of those people are going to start looking where we live and going, huh, you know, I've always been wondering what it would be like to live in Seattle. It lends a certain surreal air to Alaska's state motto, north to the future. But the reality is that we need to prepare for that. We need to think of that as part of our relationship to the wider world. The state, in its wisdom, by basically imagining what economic growth might be like and trying to figure out how many babies will be born between now and then, has figured out that they think there will be about 1 million more people in the next 20 years in the Puget Sound region. Other people guess up to 2 million in various other projections. I think those are all far too cautious. I think this is going to start to look like a really great place to live to an awful lot of people. And we're going to be dealing with much larger numbers of people coming here. And that doesn't count people like this. Maybe a few of them. But there's a lot of these people. There are going to be a lot more climate refugees. Right? The estimates are anywhere from 50 million to 1 billion people by 2050. The responsible estimates seem to be averaging about 200 to 250 million now, right? Which is about 10 times all the refugees that are in the world anywhere right now. So things are going to start changing really, really quickly. And up until now, we've been focused on 2 approaches to dealing with these kinds of problems, right? What I call the shift and what I call the swap. The shift is, you know, going green. Right? It's taking the small steps. It's doing your bit. You know, this isn't meaningless stuff. It has an impact. If everybody in the United States did all of the easy, low-hanging things, right? Insulation, hanging their clothes on the line, so on and so forth, a recent study estimated it would save about 7.5% of our national emissions. That's not nothing. That's reasonable. That's considerable. The idea that we could pretty easily and quickly do 10% just by deciding to do it is pretty realistic. And in fact, in the UK, there is a campaign to do 10% in the year 2010. Right? The problem is, of course, that still leaves another 85% to deal with, right? And that we don't have the capacity in this country to do small steps and force other people to take them. You know? And we are no longer in a position of being able to have some people do the right thing and some people not do the right thing. If we want everyone to do the right thing, we need to make systems where doing the right thing is the default option. That's why a bigger set of solutions are problematic as well, right? The swap is a lot of what we've talked about recently about sustainability. It really boils down a lot these days to this, right? We're going to take a bad component of our current system and replace it with a more ecologically sound component. Right? So we're going to get rid of our McMansion and buy a green McMansion, right? We're going to get rid of our Hummer and buy a Prius, right, or a city car. We're going to, swap out the bad for something less bad. What ends up happening here is that it ends up just revealing even more how the system's broken. Let me give you a couple examples. Clean energy is by far the most common way that people talk about the swap, right? You know, you hear it in the halls of government everywhere now, right? Oh, climate change. So what we need to do is completely replace all our power sources with clean energy, right? That's classic swap thinking. There are some problems with that, not least of which is it's not at all apparent that we can do anything like that. I encourage you to Google the term Renewistan if you want a rundown on how the possibilities of creating clean energy may be a lot more limited than we thought. But here we're already using clean energy, right? We're getting our power from places like this dam. So that's pretty great. And basically our dams are the reason why we have a lower carbon impact carbon footprint than many other places, right? So you compare us to the US average, we're down there just a little bit better than San Francisco, right? And we're doing pretty well. But, the problem is, if you take away that hydro, we start to look a lot like every other US city, right? We are not nearly as green as we think we are, right? Most of our greenness comes from the accident of living in a place that has mountains and a lot of rain. If we're serious about facing the limits that our planet is presenting to us and embracing a new model, right? If we're serious about being more like Czechoslovakia than Albania, right? We need to tackle our addiction to cars. There's just no two ways about it. We need to change things so we drive a lot less. Aren't electric cars supposed to save us? Right? Aren't these like cool Apteras, which I really want one of these, so Jetsonian, Isn't that going to work? Well, it's true that electric cars are more energy efficient. Right? And if their energy source is clean energy, they have very low operations emissions. So the answer would seem to be provide a bunch of infrastructure for electric cars, like the Project Better Place filling stations for electric cars, swap out the batteries, do whatever, and build a whole bunch of new wind farms, leaving aside the problems with supply, and we kind of solve the problem. Right? Well, not so much, because even if we could do that, it turns out that 35% of the average car's lifetime carbon footprint doesn't even come out of the tailpipe. Right? It's the making of the car, the maintaining of the car, the disposal of the car, the mining of the ore that went into the car, right? And that doesn't even count the indirect health, social, infrastructure, land use costs, et cetera. All those parts of a car's impact don't go away no matter how green the car gets. You're still driving it on a road and somebody's still manufacturing it on a production line somewhere. And in fact, building auto infrastructure alone is a pretty major contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions in this country. And in some ways, our approach is starting to look even more Albanian. For those of you who didn't get the joke, this is a cutaway of the downtown waterfront tunnel designed to usher suburban commuters from one side of our city to another. Driving less makes you money, though, right? You don't have to live in a biker's utopia to realize that we can do better than we are. Portlanders save $2.6 billion every year. New study from CEOs for Cities. That's about 3% of their region's annual economic output. And spending on cars and fuel because they own fewer cars and drive 20% fewer miles, right? They save $2.6 billion every year. Hell, they could fund Mexico to go carbon neutral with that money, right? That's a little bit of money. And it's not just cars or fuel, obviously. It's how much do we spend on roads, how much do we spend on pollution impact, healthcare costs, right? The healthcare costs of auto dependency alone are staggering, right? 42,000 Americans a year are killed in car accidents. Air quality in outer ring auto-dependent suburbs is now often worse than it is in central cities. Asthma is going up in the suburbs. Lifestyle illness is skyrocketing, and there's a real correlation between the amount of time you spend in cars and the more you weigh and the higher your blood pressure. Right? Now, it could be, it is often pointed out, that fat, angry people like to move to the suburbs, but it could be the other way around too. And in fact, driving is so bad for you that Alan Durning has pointed out that even if it takes more time to walk to work, right, your increased life expectancy actually means you gain time on the way. Right? And we know that sprawl leads to social isolation. The studies are absolutely clear that if you live in a house on a 5-acre lot, you have fewer friends, you see fewer people. And social isolation, in turn, we're finding is really bad for you. Right? It's really bad for all of us to drive off into the woods and live in our McMansions. And the health costs, it turns out, are really significant. Some of the studies coming out now suggest that it may be as much as 20% of the total US healthcare costs are the health costs of sprawl. That's a lot of money. But, we really need to drive because that's where the affordable housing is, right? Well, turns out not so much. If you combine the cost of housing with the cost of transportation into something they call the Housing and Transportation Affordability Index, what you find out is that compact places are almost always cheaper. That if you call your cost of living just your mortgage, yeah, it's cheaper to live in Enumclaw. If you call your cost of living your mortgage and your monthly gas bill, much better to be here. But the suburbs are green in other ways, right? Lots of trees, must be green. Well, it turns out that, and this is a longer argument that I won't go into, but it turns out that once you've started developing in a place, that ecosystem's pretty trashed. There's not a lot of great ecological benefit coming from the trees that are, on either side of somebody's driveway on a 5-acre lot out in the suburbs. That the best thing we can basically do with the suburbs is turn them back into livable places, right? By bringing a lot more compact development in and really reworking it, right? Sprawl just doesn't work. Sprawl is our Trabant, There are lots of things we can do here. We can revive the inner ring. There's older suburbs. 52 million Americans live there. It's a fifth of America, right? And a lot of these places are places like White Center. They're pretty cool towns, or at least they were really cool towns at one point, and they can come back and they can do cool things. We can help them, have livable cores and bring in more people to live there. There are good things that can go on in these places, right? But we need to change the way we think about sprawl, and we need to change our relationship to stuff, right? I remember when having a color TV was pretty cool. I'm that old now. Now, of course, you need a home theater, private home theater. I remember when flying first class meant that you were pretty much a rock star. Now, of course, anybody who is anybody flies their private jet. In fact, if you're really anybody, you have a flying private home theater. We need to get beyond that. And we are. We're moving into a new model. We're moving into a model where we no longer define ourselves by the amount of stuff we own. There's that old bumper sticker, right? He who has the most toys at the end wins. Well, it turns out that's totally not true. It means he who went after the most toys was kind of a loser all his life, right? It turns out that people are much less happy with many more things, right? People identify too much stuff and too much clutter and too much consumer debt as major problems in their lives, right? Meanwhile, people aren't getting the kinds of things that people actually want, right? People want more relationships, better experiences, more meaning, right? And possibilities. People want the option of being able to do things. Right? We need to change our thinking. As it was said, free your mind and your ass will follow. Right? We need to start to think about things in different ways. If you have a city that works well, you can live in smaller places and have a better life. It's just true. You can go to Copenhagen, and pretty hard to argue that the Danes are not living high on the hog, but their average home is much smaller than ours. And density and efficiency and post-ownership, these things reinforce each other, right? You can look at CO2 emissions from places, and you find that the most sustainable trip is the one you never had to make, because what you wanted was already close by. The denser the community, the lower its greenhouse gases. In fact, compact development is the closest thing we have to a simple answer on climate change. If we had to pick just one thing to do, it would be bulldoze the suburbs and all move into better cities. Seriously. Adding green building into the mix means the numbers get even better. And it doesn't mean, right, that there's this idea that green building is somehow opposed to density. It's just not true. This is Bjarke Ingels in Copenhagen, has built a building called the Mountain. Each one of these homes is a passive home, right? It draws all its heat and cooling from nature. Very green, right? And very, very dense. It is possible to add all these things together. And our climate isn't even that much of a barrier. Bill Dunster, who's the zero energy home genius in England, builds homes that get no outside power all the way up in the north of England, which he described to me as one of the few parts of the inhabited world with less sunshine than Seattle. So if they can do it there, and in fact, all that rain can be a resource. Right? There are ways to rebuild our infrastructure, to be greener, to soak up that water, to use it for things that we need. We have pretty great utilities here. They're doing a pretty good job, actually. We are lucky in that. But we could go farther, right? There's no reason why we couldn't start to think of our cities like Melbourne has, as watersheds themselves, and places that we're going to use water that comes through it, and the water that flows out of it will be as clean as if it were flowing in a stream, right? That's the goal that we ought to have. And there's just thousands of these innovations, right? They're all over the place. And it turns out that they really work. Unfortunately, we don't have any one place where they are working, right? There's this example over here, there's that example over there. Right? And people often go, well, show me the ideal eco-city. Well, it doesn't exist, right? You'd have to layer all sorts of other cities over each other. And then people often say, you know, this stuff costs so much money. Well, and that's when it's important to remind ourselves that if it makes you money, it's not a cost, it's an investment. Right? Stuff that saves you money on energy, on water, on housing, on the kind of stuff you need to have in your life, on your healthcare costs, that is putting money in the bank. That's an investment. Right? You get richer by doing this stuff. It's pretty much guaranteed. You know? And if you make your cities right, you get not only richer, you get happier. Right? And here's where we can really draw on the experience of others in Europe and elsewhere. Right? Anyone who thinks that living in a compact city with fewer things means that you are, you know, somehow a deprived person needs to go to Barcelona. In fact, we maybe ought to just like have a government program that regularly ships Americans to Barcelona. Because, man, that place rocks, right? I mean, it is a good time there. People have a lot of fun in Barcelona, and they live very, very well. Frankly, in many ways, better than the average American. Now, the new way of life that we need to move towards is going to look and feel strange to a lot of us. And sometimes we're going to get it wrong. Right? We're going to try things that seemed like great ideas at the time, but it's the way that you avoid being Albania. Right? It's how you avoid locking into systems that are headed down. And when we get it right, what we learn becomes worth money. Right? The expertise we gain is a marketable commodity, which is why there's a fierce competition brewing out there right now to become the greenest city. Right? So you have Vancouver, you know, with a bright green future, an action plan for becoming the world's greenest city by 2030, you know, Copenhagen climate plan, et cetera. All these various plans that are coming out, people want to move to the forefront because there's an enormous amount of what we know as first mover advantage. Right? The person who gets there first, who's known as the greenest, who has the best ideas, who draws the best talent, does better, a lot better than the next person, and that person does a lot better than the next person, and so on, right? Being first or second or third among all the cities in the world in driving towards a bright green economy, that's pretty great. Being 38th, well, it's better than nothing. You know, and we really ought to thank Mayor Nichols for one thing he's done for us, which is really putting climate on the table as an issue here in this city, and really going out and selling the idea that Seattle's acting on climate. You know, I think that he really deserves our thanks for that. It was a good thing that he did. However, yes, thanks. Absolutely. You know, the problem is, like the title of that great demotivational guide, we're not as good as we think we are, right? We keep hitting really high numbers in all these rating systems and, you know, like in the Smarter Cities rating. Look, we're #1, right? But the problem is these ratings tend to rate things we do a pretty good job on and conveniently ignore the things we really kind of, you know, don't do a very good job on, you know, and so we keep looking a lot better than we are. And on the one hand, we can say, yay, haphazard ratings, you know, because it really has helped us. You know, and it really has meant that people out there have this idea that, you know, that here in Seattle, unicorns pick up our recycling and our cars run on fairy dust, right? They have this idea that we are already the Emerald City, you know, charging forward into the future. And that gives us an opportunity, right? Because it means that even though we are, in fact, behind the curve compared to many other places, we still have this enormous marketing advantage. And if we can actually start to change things in rapid succession, we're going to gain the ability to launch whole industries that we can compete with on an international basis, right? We can propel ourselves to the forefront of this globally competitive race simply by being bold now. We have that opportunity. That's something a lot of people don't have the opportunity to do. In many ways, this is the Seattle moment. This is a critical time. Right? The choices we make in just the next couple of years are going to decide what's possible in the next 20. What happens in the next 20 is going to decide what's possible in the next 40. What happens in the next 40 years is going to decide what's possible for hundreds of generations. That makes it a pretty darn important time, you know? And we are a critical place. Right? The rest of the world thinks we're magical, right? Our success means something to them. We blow it and they're going to be like, even Seattle couldn't do it. But we get it right and they're like, oh yeah, let's embrace the Seattle model, right? We can, in fact, lead the world here, right? We can help to redefine the possible. We can ready ourselves for the kind of change that we know is already coming and be at the forefront of the next great economic revolution. But to do that, we need a big goal, and we need to move towards it fast. I think the only goal that really is worthy of us is to become the first carbon neutral city in North America. We need to drop our net per capita greenhouse gas emissions to nothing. We need to eliminate our carbon footprint. And we need to do it by 2030, because that's what the planet needs. No other goal is good enough. That's not an easy task, right? We're not going to be able to just, walk out that door and get that done. But we can start. We can start here tonight. Right? We can start thinking about what that would mean and how we can do it. Because we can become a place where people live not off nature, but with it. We have that potential. We have the intellectual capacity. We have the engineering ability. We have technology. We have universities. We have an educated populace. We have people who care. Right? Seattleites were just told repeatedly by our supposed leaders that a slate of candidates on our local ballot were too green for us. Right? We didn't think that was so. Right? We just elected a new mayor. We just elected several new council members. We just returned our greenest council member to office by the largest margin in Seattle history. Right? I think Seattleites are ready to go. I think we're ready to do something. I think we're ready to declare a big goal and make it happen. I think we can do this. If you come back tomorrow, I'll tell you how. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.